Hi, I'm going to jump on a thread today that was launched by Chris Profi, Musically Obsessed. And the thread is I Don't Need You. So it's for artists who were with successful bands, maybe successful bands, and then they gave them the middle finger and decided I'm going to go off and do something on my own. So I picked up on this from the usual suspects, Brian Embryonic Robot, Mike MGK Boston, and a handful of others as well. And I thought, well, I better get in there before all the names are taken. So I thought very quickly just review the some of the obvious ones that I probably would have picked if I jumped on this straight away. First one is Paul Simon. So abandoned Art Garfunkel. That was 1972. Rick Wakeman, The Six Wives of Henry VIII, left yes after Tales from Topographic Oceans. It's a mouthful. And I met him once and I got his autograph. So the autograph in here, Virgin Megastore or something in Newcastle. So that's good old Rick. Of course, we all know about this one who gave the middle finger to Pink Floyd and then, dare I say, lived to regret it. Maybe he did, but we'll see when the history books are written. This guy here, did he give the middle finger? I'm not sure. I think the band just dissolved, and then he went out on his own. And this is, of course, Mozza and Viva Hate. And finally, before I get into my choices, Peter Gabriel left Genesis in 1975 after the Lamb Lies Down on Broadway tour, and then launched what became a very successful solo career. So, my 5 choices. Well, sticking with the Genesis theme, in 1977, but 1976, December, this album was released by Genesis, Wind and Wuthering. It was the last album to include Steve Hackett on guitar. And Peter Gabriel left, just a year and a half, 18 months earlier. And Steve Hackett might have been expected, might have himself expected that with Gabriel out of the way, he would get a little bit more of the bandwidth when it came to songwriting and influencing the direction of the band. And I think what he didn't take account of is that Peter Gabriel was a counterbalance to the dominant figure of Tony Banks in the band. And once Gabriel was out of the way, even though Hackett had some great moments on this album and the preceding album, I think what happened is that Tony Banks's kind of power as a founding member kind of took over, and then Steve Hackett decided to leave. And part of the reason might be because he'd released a solo album, Voyage of the Acolyte, while he was still with the band, and that was really successful. And it's really interesting when I think about all the solo acts that came out of Genesis. Um, Tony Banks, the least successful, I think. Interesting that. But this was an album he released while he was in the band. But then the first album he released once he'd left, first of 27 further albums, so 28 in total, I think, was Please Don't Touch. And this had a really eclectic mix of singers. Richie Havens on here, Steve Walsh, um, Randy Crawford. Fantastic, beautiful song called "Hoping Love Will Last." It's a good album, that one, but it's a real kind of a bit of a mix up. And then finally, he released an album in 1996, I think it's called Genesis Revisited, and he went on to do a double album. Was it triple album of Genesis Revisited 2, about 10 years later, something like that, 10, 12 years later. And this one is really interesting because this one, he plays with the arrangements and the instrumentation, and it's really quite adventurous. So it's a good thing. The follow-up album, that 10, 12 years later, the follow-up Genesis Revisited one, that was like carbon copy of the Genesis tracks, and consequently, although it was sound wise superior to those early Genesis albums, quite frankly, it was just bland and boring. Travesty, really. So that's Steve Hackett. Right. Number 2. Um, this guy was part of a very, very important trio in British rock and new wave music from the late 70s onwards, and that was Paul Weller's The Jam. And it was Paul Weller's because he wrote almost all of the songs and he was the dominant figure in the band. And he broke up the band because he wanted to move on, not because the band dissolved naturally. He basically said, "I've had enough. I want to do my own thing." And even though he didn't immediately go into a solo career because he had the Style Council, of course, but there again, that was absolutely his band, his blueprint. He then went off and had a very, very successful solo career. And this is probably my favorite album from that career. I'm still buying his records now. I've never found him to be a really authentic singer. I think his vocals are a bit forced. But this one was 2005, and this has got some of the edge of those jam tracks. What have we got here? From the floorboards up is superb. Uh, Come on, let's go is great as well. But yeah, it's a great album. A creditable artist, even though he's not one of my absolute favorites. Number three is the guy behind this behemoth, The Police, and this is their final album, Synchronicity. Um, Again, just like Weller, he decided he was bigger than the band, or potentially bigger than the band. And I think what he basically wanted to do is he wanted to vary the instrumentation. So another trio, just like the Jam, he thought it was too restricting for him, even though the musical palette on this particular album is really broad. But of course, he then went into more of a jazz feel on his Dream of the Blue Turtles, his first solo album. So here's Sting's solo albums. The complete studio collection. This has been surpassed or added to by a couple of other albums since, but this is Sting. Definitely his own man, definitely in charge of his own career. So bye bye, The Police. In similar fashion, we had another one associated with my hometown, and that is Mark Knopfler. And this was the final album with Dire Straits, On Every Street. Really underrated album because it came after Brothers in Arms, which had lots of hit singles on it. Not so much here, but still a very, very good Dire Straits album. And then he started a solo career. He'd also experimented, a bit like Steve Hackett, while in the band doing something else. He wrote the Local Hero soundtrack, which was hugely successful. But his first solo album was Golden Heart. After leaving the band, and again, he's been very successful, enormously successful as a solo artist. Although it's worth saying that I think as the albums go on, and particularly this last one, seems very tired in comparison with some of the earlier efforts as a solo artist. And a final one. In the 1990s, there was a flurry of activity around the genre of Americana. It was like a new wave of Americana and still had that kind of rustic folk country feel. And it lots of bands came out of North America and some in Europe too. And one of them that I really really like, and I am going to do another video on my favorite kind of Americana albums, and it won't include the usual suspects like the band and so on. But one of the bands that came out in the 1990s was this Norwegian band called Midnight Choir, and this was their breakthrough album. I think this was the third album, might have been the fourth, Amsterdam Stranded. And you've got lovely, creamy guitar within this band, and yearning local vocals by the lead singer Paul Flatter, I think it is. The follow-up album to that one, it's worth getting a hold of. I'd love to get Amsterdam Stranded on vinyl, but this is Unsung Heroine, which, as it says, the follow-up. This again is gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. Great late night feel, bit of energy, but that lovely, creamy, warm sound. It's gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. Anyway, I think, or rather than give the middle finger, I think the lead singer kind of tried to rebuild a solo career after the band kind of dissolved in the mid 2000, I think 2005, I think it was 2004, 2005. And you can always tell because the best of or the greatest hits comes out when there are no hits. I think it was just the best of. Anyway, he continued in a similar vein and produced this album called Rain. This is the same yearning vocals, late night vibe. Just gorgeous, really gorgeous. And so that's he's I wouldn't say a successful solo artist, but one of the ones that I do listen to fairly frequently. So there we go. That's that thread. I Don't Need You. Well, I think Paul Flatter needed Midnight Choir, but I think the others all succeeded in building really successful solo careers. So all credit to them. So I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.